Okay, happy Monday, everyone. Hope that you are doing well. Thank you for joining us. And you may recognize Scott Walter, and we also have a familiar face today to talk about hot staging for Starship. So, Ozan, if you could introduce yourself and give us a little background.
Sure. Hi, Ellie. So I guess I would say that I'm a rocket nerd. I'm a software guy who got really interested in aerospace when I was about 3, and then just along the way, I've picked up a thing or two. And in my spare time, I like to write code to simulate the physics of rocket launches and things like that. And so I like to mess with the numbers.
Right.
So that's kind of what I'm hoping to contribute today.
And I'm guessing you're a big SpaceX fan.
I am, yes.
However, a SpaceX fan, but not afraid to maybe discuss or, look at some of the, you guys are both thinking that there might be some issues with the upcoming hot staging technique that, they're making the modifications for right now. They tweeted some photos in the past, or I'm sorry, posted. It's not tweeting anymore, right? Have to correct with the language. But Scott, do you want to maybe pull those photos up and we can see?
Yeah, we'll pull it up. Maybe just before we do that, just a little bit of background. What we're talking about is hot staging is just a different way of being able to do the staging between the first and second stage. Right. And there's been a lot of discussion back and forth, which is a good idea. They're replacing what was probably even crazier idea of doing that weird flip catapult thing, which is why in the first launch, we couldn't tell, was the vehicle breaking up or is it actually a planned maneuver?
Right.
And it seems like they realized that maybe it wasn't such a good idea and they're going to another method. And we're going to break down why they want to go into that method versus the traditional tried and true way. What problems they are trying to solve going that way? Are they trying to get more efficiency? And what it really comes down to is it's not so much that they're trying to solve a problem, they're trying to solve a problem of their own creation. Okay, we know how to solve the problem that they're trying to solve, but they are trying to solve it a different way that they hope is going to make the overall vehicle more efficient by shedding unnecessary mass and everything else. And we'll try to break all that stuff down. And again, we want to make sure that the audience participates if they have any sort of questions about what's going on. So
however,
first thing,
just to clarify, you guys are both a little concerned about the hot staging and it being a point of failure. Both of you agree?
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
Yeah. So I think that it's a risk for this launch. I think it's one of those things that they'll eventually get right.
Yes.
It's very much doable. It's just a question of whenever you introduce something like this, there are always details and kinks to work out, and it might take a few tries.
Okay.
Yeah. So Ellie, you want to see the pictures first, or do you want to see some examples explaining what hot staging is?
Let's start with the pictures because with my new
and then we're going to go back to them.
We got to know what's new, what's current right now, and I especially love the photo of the very small man sitting atop the booster. I mean, what a perspective there. I don't know if you.
He's just going to ride that.
Yeah.
Okay, let me
see. Can you see this right now? Can you see this image?
Now we can see it. Yes.
Okay. So this was one of 2 images that were tweeted in, I guess it's the high bay or the mega bay or whatever bays are left there.
Yeah.
And this is the new, I guess, the hot staging ring or the interstage ring. These are the vents that are going to be needed. So that means the Starship stack is going to be a little bit taller. They're adding something in between. And my guess is that ring might be about 2 meters in size. So I'll kind of zoom in a little bit and we can sort of see what's going on here. So this is the underside of it. And you can see all the ribbing in there to get in there. And the top is sort of the heat shield. And then the next image that they have here that I'll try to bring up was this one, which is the one you're thinking about for scale. And here
where is it?
And do we see it? Do we see it coming up?
Or
we don't see it.
You don't see anything. You probably see the old one, right?
You see the old one, yes.
Oh, okay. Probably because the share on here gets a bit crazy sometimes. Now I got to find the right screen right now to make sure I go ahead and share the right screen. So let me stop. Because I think what I was doing is I was presenting a window, not a screen here.
Well, why don't I ask this question from Ross, who always is participating. So thank you, Ross. He wants to know, hot staging is risky, but is it riskier for the booster or the ship?
Both.
Both. Yeah.
It's hard to tell
Yeah.
which one. Yeah, it kind of depends a little bit on how you do it and the way that they're doing it. It's hard to tell which one it's riskier for. And we actually don't know exactly how they're going to do it, but based on the structure that they have, the different configurations that they might light the engines, and what they might leave on and at what thrust on stage one, and just how thick that steel is and all that stuff. It could go either way. But I can tell you that there's definitely a way with what that hardware looks like to make it fairly benign for the booster. And assuming that the engines don't get blown up by the blowback, and the stagnation pressure building up, then it should be, and assuming that all the engines light properly, and they're able to throttle them well enough, then it should be fine for second stage as well.
Yeah, everything has to work right. So this is the thing, is that if everything goes right, it will work. But if one thing just doesn't quite work right, it's going to fail. So that's kind of the issues. And you say there's some nuances in what's going on that will go into one of the tweet threads that kind of explained it. But Ellie, are you seeing what I just attempted to share, or do I need to try?
Here we go.
Okay, good. So this is the second image, and let me zoom on. So this is how it was tweeted, posted out, and we can see that's a long way down there. And the interesting bits are here. So the image that we just saw, this is it now being married on top of the booster section that's there. Now this is not the top of the tank. This is the new heat shield. So Ellie, remember when we looked at the Saturn V and we walked underneath it?
Yes.
And I asked you to explain what's going on here. We walked under one section of the Saturn V where it was very smooth like this. And I said, what is this section of the tank? And I think you were able to tell me that it's the fuel tank, right?
Yeah.
It's the outer skin of the fuel tank. Then we walked over to a section of the Saturn V. It was very corrugated like this. And I said, okay, what's going on here? And do you remember what was going on in there?
I don't like pop quizzes.
Well, this is basically the bulkhead, because remember, this is a cylinder, and the cylinder has a cap to it. And the cap is not a flat cap, but it's a hemisphere. And so the hemisphere is going to fit in there. And the hemisphere fits in about maybe half or 3/4 of it. And then there's like room for other stuff. So, this only has room for fuel. Fins. Right. You don't have room for avionics, in this case, the grid fin controls. I mean, all the other stuff. So in here, you've got a little bit of space you can take advantage of. But because it's not pressurized like here, it doesn't have the same strength as the steel down here. So you have to reinforce it, because this is what is basically transferring the load, the thrust load, from underneath up to that upper stage and bringing it on up there. So that's what's going on here. And it's designed to have the Starship mate right along that circumference here. But now suddenly you're changing the whole design criteria. You're adding this other ring in there.
Yeah.
And this ring has to be designed to be venting. You basically have to have, open windows in here, because the exhaust has to vent out there, unlike here, which is closed up. So now you have complete design change in your requirements here. You're extending the length of everything here. And there's just a question about stability and all. So the top of the tank is down here somewhere, and you've got pretty much a pretty big air gap that goes from here to the top of that heat shield. So that's what's going on now. Somewhere I've got an image. I'm going to try to bring it up, of something I tweeted out the other day. And we'll go ahead and get the slideshow going here. And so if I just kind of run through here, this is what it currently looks like. Oh, this is at least what it looked like on the April 20th flight. So you can see this is the top of the Super Heavy right there. And then you see that there's that hemispherical dome. And actually the hemispherical dome comes right up to the very top there. And then you have a little bit of space in here, like up in your attic or something like that, to be able to shove in any extra things that you need. And you see those engine bells come right down on top of that. So that's the current design, the way it is. Now, what I said was like, okay, this is what's happening now, is basically you're splicing this thing in between the two.
Oh, wow.
And so what that means is the top of that bulkhead under here basically comes to right there. And then this is here. And of course, we're expecting that those engine bells are going to be right on top of this thing.
Well, and Scott, while you have that photo up, this is something I think we were just mentioning before. Alan wants to know, will there be a hot stage, a static fire test?
Well, yeah, that's one of the things we want to get into. So I don't know. Do you want to put a pin on that, or do you want to address that right now? Because I have opinions about that, and I know Ozan also has some opinions, and a lot of people in our threads also have pretty strong opinions about that. So Ozan, you want to take that?
Yeah.
Sure. As far as I know, that's not currently planned. It seems like, given that they were looking at launching as early as August 31st, if they get everything ready and they get approvals, it doesn't seem like they would have time for a static fire test. It doesn't seem like they're planning on that. But I think there are definitely reasons for and against, right? I would like to see one before they try this on their next launch. And I think that mainly that has to do with just maximizing the chances of success for the next launch. Yeah. I think in terms of optics, in terms of confidence, in terms of interactions with NASA, it could be really beneficial to iron this out. Of course, on the ground, there's a higher risk. You have more ambient pressure. That's going to make it harder for the vacuum raptors to fire without blowing themselves to pieces, and it's also going to increase the heat load on some of those surfaces. But if it works on the ground, you pretty much know. Well, you can say with a greater degree of confidence that it's going to work in the air.
Yeah. Now, I have kind of the controversial take on this.
Okay.
Famously back in July, or not July, in April, when everyone was saying like, oh, it's going to be a year before they can rebuild the pad. That's it. There's not going to be any more tests or anything like that. There was a doom and gloom. I was already saying, well, wait a minute. If they really wanted to, get things on track and everything, they could take just the Starship itself and, do the single stage to orbit. And I kind of jokingly said they could do it in 2 weeks. And I really think they could. They have enough of them around there that if they wanted to, they could just kind of go over and gas one of those up and test it out. And that's when Ozan and Aeneas first kind of came into one of my tweet threads and how we've kind of met. And I've been able to really respect a lot of the numbers they do. So I'm the one who like the harebrained ideas. And they're like the guys that run the numbers and tell me, no, you're wrong, or you're right, or, well, just because you get that number from Wikipedia, don't trust it kind of thing. So there were a few things like that. But what I'm thinking is that they are just putting out a notice to mariners to expect a test launch on the 31st of August. They didn't say what it is. They didn't say it's a full stack launch.
Right.
So as far as we know, they have some other idea. Now, there's a couple of things they could do. One is they could actually take the full booster and stack everything on it and just load it up with nitrogen, just pressurize the thing, but not actually launch the Super Heavy, and then just attempt to do hot staging on the pad. And then, either go suborbital or maybe even potentially orbital with it, depending on what they have. But they could attempt to do that. Now, that's kind of crazy and dangerous because if that thing ruds, it takes the whole pad out. So that's extremely dangerous to do. The other thing they could possibly do, and someone claims that there's a second ring that they may have been using for testing, take that over to the suborbital pad and test it there on the ground. And then maybe you make a small booster, don't make the full booster, but just make kind of a little bit of a section here just to sort of simulate what the tank underneath is going to be like, have that ring and everything else, and just test it there. And I mean, so that's, if they were going to do something on the 31st of August, I think that's the only thing they could do in that amount of time. Because, I'm looking at my watch, I'm like, it's less than 2 weeks now.
So many of my viewers and people on X are messaging me. They really think it's going to be the 31st. And I just think there's no way.
It's never on the, earliest possible date. That's the earliest possible date. And it's always aspirational, and it's pending regulatory approval. It's they're not going to be ready, and the regulators are definitely not going to be ready.
Well, and that's the bigger hang up, I think. And so it blows my mind, the amount of people texting me like, oh, did you hear? And I'm like, no, like, it's just, why are you believing this?
Yeah.
There's always so much optimism. And it's the same with every project. Oh yeah, SLS is definitely going to launch next November. And Ariane 6, sure. Early next spring, yeah, definitely.
Oh, wow. Look at that. What a place to have lunch.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Now, the one thing we can notice here is that everyone was assuming it was going to be a dome in here for the heat shield. And we can see that it's not. Now, I was a bit fooled because the perspective will do this. I thought this was still a hemisphere here that was just lopped off of the top. And then when I started to cat it up, I realized that, no, that really is a cone.
It's a cone.
That's a flat cone, but it gives the illusion that it's somehow curved because of perspective and everything else. So that is a truncated cone on top of that. And of course, we saw in the earlier section that it was, the ribs that were underneath it. And I think we'll revisit it in a second. But we can see what's going on here, that these are all the vents. So when the hot staging happens, the exhaust has some place to go. You see that they are kind of fortified. And at first I was a bit worried. It looked like it was really flimsy when they were transporting it. And it was very dark. And I thought, oh my goodness, they don't have enough cross bracing or anything else, because you couldn't see it in those dark images. All I saw was this. But now you can see that they have what literally is an X. I mean, if you look closer and look right in there, I wonder if that is intentional or really the way structural. I mean, that looks like a perfect X. Look up here. You see the top of the X. You see the serif on the X coming on down there. So those are nice cross members here. And there's 6 of them around here. And so they're spaced enough that I think they give enough rigidity along with what's in here, the bracing that's behind it, that it's probably okay as far as the strength they're going to need to be able to put the booster on it. And you have these things here. And of course you have the hold down clamps, 3 hold down clamps, which it's remarkable that 3 hold down clamps is all you need. And there's a reason that you only need 3. And they have the others without it, but they're there also for the structural integrity. Now, these guys here, these clamps, that's what keeps the Starship from falling off. Well, supposedly. The one thing that keeps Starship from falling off is if this is the Heavy and this is the Starship, is gravity and the lip that we can see in here. So when you look in here, you can see there's quite the lip. And so this is transferring, that lip is what's transferring all the force to make it go up. And the lip is keeping it from doing this. However, you do need to make sure that you have those clamps on there. Otherwise, obviously, it could easily disengage if you stop thrusting. So the second you stop thrusting, it could potentially just kind of come off. And of course, when you do your gravity turn, you're going to have little things like that. So it's enough to be able to hold it in, but most of the forces are being, let's say, carried by other structures within here that work really quite well. But Ozan, you might be able to explain this a little bit. Do you remember the pogo effect?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it's not like you can just trust gravity to hold that thing on. If you start getting vibrations like this, which can happen, this pogoing, you could end up getting something like that. And that's bad. Now, the reason why they have, they don't have 2 clamps is that if you have 2 clamps, they would be opposed to each other. You're going to get rotation like this. You're basically going to have a pivot point, and that's going to be really bad. 3 basically defines a plane really well, and that's the minimum you would need. And I might argue 3 is even better than 4. I mean, some people might say, why don't you have 4? And say, the reason why is now you get 2 kind of axes that are crossed to each other like this, which are independent. And a lot of times putting it in with 3 like this will give you a little bit more stability. So I would go with either 3 or 6 and no other number. But you could go with 5. A pentagon might be all right.
Ray makes the point that those only 3 clamps seem to hold it well as it was doing flips on April 20th.
Yeah.
And
so
we
believe
it's
about
3. That. I want to. There were a lot of comments about how did this stay together. They didn't let go of the clamps. Even if they hadn't let go of the clamps, it's possible that it would have stayed together, minus the pogo effect, because the first stage never stopped thrusting until it broke up, as I recall.
Yeah.
And the aerodynamic forces involved were not large enough to counter the amount of stability provided by that thrust pushing the 2 stages together.
Yeah, so it's quite possible that it didn't require very much, because you had that lip. You'd have to get just enough separation to get over that lip, and if you're thrusting enough, that's going to happen. So obviously, if you're thrusting, then this, stop thrusting. This is just falling down, and then you would end up getting that. And no, we're not sponsored by San Pellegrino. That's the only thing I can find. I don't have Coke cans around here. I don't drink soda.
Well,
I was desperately looking for cans.
You need to
All right.
your own 3D printed Starship.
Yeah. So it's about time. So we need to get one of those things. Now, the question is how everything's going to fit in here and what are some of our concerns? So I'm thinking what I'd like to do is right now is maybe actually start. I think you can see this tweet that started out from Ozan. Talking about a lot of things that are going on here. Now, the first thing here is there's a really nice sequence, and we'll show a little bit later the sequence put together by, I don't think it's just Ryan Hansen, but I think it was Alex Swan, showing kind of the different parts of the hot staging. So this is not the Starship exploding. This is basically the venting that has to happen when you light up the second stage, and kind of an idea what it's going to look like. And this resulted in quite a very interesting set of discussions going on here. And I think that one of them, if I recall, somewhere in here, that was every day. And wait a minute, let me get one more of them in here. This one, Clinton Joy, worked out kind of the sequences of staging. And this is the nuance of what's going on.
Do you mind clicking on those? I haven't seen this one.
Yeah, so we'll click on a little bit and ask. So basically, I'll try to demonstrate it a little bit. The first thing, if you remember, and I'm not sure if it was the second or third Falcon 1 launch, the reason it failed is because of the staging. And what ended up happening is that when they did the separation, they thought they separated, and then the first stage came back up and bumped the second stage.
Yikes.
And part of that reason is that while they separated, I think the first stage engine had not fully cut down yet. And not cut off. So it still was producing enough thrust to kind of come back. So you thought, oh, we're going to push off, and then it comes back and hits it. This is the concern we have, because the sequence of the hot staging is never stop thrusting. So right now, when staging happens, you go up and then you have MECO, main engine cutoff. You now have a coast phase. You now have these motors of some sort, RCS motors or ullage motors, that causes the separation between the two vehicles. Once you get the separation, it's now safe to light up the second stage engines without, it basically causing damage to the booster or anything like that. But before you can do that staging, the problem with coasting is what happens, Ozan, during the coast?
Well, you get propellant getting unsettled.
Yes.
So what you have in the tanks is a mixture of liquid and gas, right? As the liquid drains, you have to fill up the space that remains with gas, and it's relatively high pressure gas. It's not nearly as high pressure as what you have in the engines, but it's depending on the booster, it's like usually a few times atmospheric pressure.
Right.
So for Starship, it's going to be a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
And
so basically here's your rocket. Here's your rocket engine. Here's your propellant. You want the propellant to be down here. And as you drain that propellant, you are creating ullage or an empty space up here, which you have to fill up with usually some sort of ullage gas, or might actually be like the hot propellant coming on back. But you have to fill that void somehow with something.
Yeah.
And so long as you are thrusting and so long as you've got gravity, the heavy stuff is going to go down here and the light stuff's going to go up there. As soon as you stop thrusting, it changes. It basically reverses. And now imagine, turn your heads upside down and everything. This is what ends up happening. The propellant goes up there, and now suddenly the air or the ullage is down here. And if you suck that into your engine, all sorts of bad things are going to happen. Your turbines are going to overspin. You're going to sputter and lose thrust and everything else. You do not want that situation to happen at all. Right. And it happens really quickly. So you get this ullage collapse that you have to solve. And the only way you can solve that is you got to push the vehicle a little bit. You've got to create an artificial gravity. Doesn't have to be full gravity. You got to pull stuff. And that's what the ullage motors do, or the RCS. Yeah. But what's the one thing Elon hates?
Complexity. Unnecessary.
Complexity and extra parts. He wants to get rid of the parts. So he's like, I don't want the ullage motors. Get rid of the ullage motors. Okay, we're going to get rid of the ullage motors. So how are we going to prevent ullage collapse? There's another thing. What do they want to do with this thing? They want to bring this back to Earth, right? They want to bring it back to the pad. To bring it back to the pad, you need to have a burn back. So that means if you shut this thing down, you have to light this thing back up. Yeah. What does Elon hate worse than parts? Processes. Okay, so he doesn't want the process of having to light this thing up a second time. If it's already burning, keep it burning. So here are the constraints. We want to use the super heavy to act as the ullage motors for here. And then after we get the separation, we're not going to shut this down. My belief is they don't shut it down. I think there's some others that think they might shut it down. I think it keeps thrusting, and then it does the boost back, and then this continues on. And this thing is lighting up when it's dangerously close to the whole thing. So that's what I'm saying, is that you are juggling a lot of balls in the air at the same time. Everything has to go right. And the biggest trick here is, remember, this thing is still thrusting. What happens when you light this thing up and they separate? When you light that thing up and you start to get a separation, do you have an idea? Well, right now, you have 3 motors at 50%. So they shut everything down except the 3. They're at 50%. You are now thrusting through here, and those motors are thrusting on the full stack. Where is the majority of the mass of the full stack right now when you're coming up to staging?
It's in the
It's up here.
stage.
This is the full can. This can is almost empty. So now if you take this can away, suddenly these 3 engines are operating on a piece of equipment that has suddenly lost a lot of mass. It's very light, which means it's now going to accelerate faster than it just was. So that means you have to guarantee that this guy accelerates faster than this one when you pull that trick. Now, you get 3 engines that are at 50%. We think they're lighting 3 engines here. And those 3 engines we're hoping are going at 100%. So that might mean you have twice the thrust. The question is this half the mass of this? If this is half the mass of this, then that means when you light those things up, they're going to have about equal acceleration. And you cannot go below 50%. It throttles down to 50. You can't go to 40. 50 is like the low end. And so you're kind of right there. You want to make sure you get enough.
There's some,
yeah.
Yeah, has 50% been confirmed? Because some people are speculating 40, some people are speculating 50.
Okay. So maybe it can go down to 40. I mean, we're hearing about that. So the deep throttle might be that's at 50. Yeah. So when you go below that, of course, it gets risky on whether you're going to get a flame out or not. So that's pretty much what is going on with that. So you're trying to do it, and that's what these charts are. So if you put the charts back up there, Clinton Joy is trying to look at the different scenarios of trying to figure out of the thrust to mass and everything else that's going on with this thing, that when you separate, are we going to separate and then have it come back and crash into it? Or is it going to like really cleanly get away from there? And then the other thing is like, how long do we have to keep it in there to get that startup? And the one thing that Ozan pointed out is like, don't forget about blowback. And when I say blowback, I don't mean that a tweet you regret or a post that you regret. But since you came up with the term, Ozan, what is it?
Well, what I'm talking about there is basically that as you're blowing that exhaust gas down from the vacuum raptors, if you think about where that's going, the way that you're getting thrust on the first stage is that you're pushing down on that exhaust gas, and that exhaust gas is going down at about almost 3.5 kilometers per second. All that mass carries that momentum, and you get an equal amount of momentum per second up as you go on the second stage. But that gas isn't just going straight down the sides. What you have is that hot staging ring that's effectively deflecting it. And we don't know exactly what angle it's going to deflect it at, but if it was deflecting sideways, then that exhaust no longer carries any axial momentum, right? It's no longer carrying any momentum up or down. It's now only sideways. Newton's third law, every action needs to have an equal and opposite reaction. Whatever force you're pushing the second stage up with, that force minus whatever is being carried away by the exhaust is what's going to end up on the first stage. So that deflector basically takes that load, the conical section. All right. So if you end up with a scenario where your exhaust gases are being flared out exactly, radially, just out, then that force is getting transferred to the first stage. So in that situation, when you first light it up, you have the upper stage motors basically arm wrestling with the first stage motors for which way the first stage booster is going to go, which way it's going to accelerate. As you get some separation, more of that exhaust is able to kind of go around the booster and go down and not impart so much force on the first stage. So you have this kind of awkward situation where you start out with the first stage getting blown down by the second stage, and then as they separate, that force quickly going down, and you have a first stage that potentially has a higher thrust to weight ratio and can start to catch up to the second stage. Now, the question is, how much thrust do you need on the second stage to get enough distance that that's not an issue? And I contend that if you start with the vacuum Raptors at about half thrust, or somewhere between half thrust and full thrust, depending on what that exhaust deflection angle is, then you're going to have enough to separate without causing the first stage to decelerate and not have so much thrust that you cause the first stage to decelerate down. But as you separate, you need to increase the thrust on the second stage. So you crank up the throttle on the or you take the throttle back up to 100% on those RVACs, and then at some point you also start up the sea level Raptors. You can do that fairly early on, but the RVACs should be enough to get you to safe distance.
Mm-hmm. So this is like a pretty good animation put together. Well, a sequence of stills put together by Alex Vaughn, showing like, this is what it will probably be looking like. And of course, I guess he's expecting a couple of engines out, maybe not. And then the next image is sort of showing the startup sequence here of the hot staging. So suddenly now you're getting some venting. You're just getting a startup. So that's the idea of the vents, is the exhaust is going to be coming from there. And then it goes from being, let's just say, warm staging to really hot staging here. So you're going to have a lot of that out there. And it seems like, here he's showing that there's only going to be 3 of the center of the core engines here thrusting. And then you're going to have only the RVACs is the expectation. That, it's not confirmed, but we're speculating that would make sense. And then you're getting the blowback on the booster that you can kind of see right here. And then eventually, all 3 of these are going to light to really get that separation. And now he is showing shutdown of all the engines. I don't think there's shutdown there, but I could be wrong. I mean, if you put it together and he's getting a lot of info from Everyday Astronaut, that might be more informed speculation than mine. But my expectation is that it's continuing all the way through.
That gets us to why they're doing this, right? And I think that there's a lot of misconception online about what does the hot staging buy you in terms of performance, and how does it buy you that. People are expecting, if you never stop thrusting, then you have less in gravity losses.
Yeah, a little bit.
And yeah, and so I think there was an Elon tweet a while back saying that because of this hot staging, they're going to be able to increase performance. And then they were looking at, did he say 10%, 20%?
It was
10%, right?
Which
10%. So what wasn't clear was whether that was due to just the hot staging or to other changes that paired with the hot staging, right? And I've been scratching my head trying to figure out where's that coming from, because if you eliminate the coast phase, the gravity losses from the coast phase alone, that basically buys you about 1 to 2%, which also happens to be about how much you lose by adding the weight of that hot staging ring. So it's pretty much a wash. Like, that ring is basically worth its weight in performance. Like, it pays for itself and nothing more if you have a reasonable amount of coast in a reasonable coast period.
Well,
and it may be that it buys a 10% on the booster stage itself, having maybe more margins for returning. It may not be so much payload to orbit. So other ways in there. Yeah. So
that's where it gets interesting, because you were talking earlier, Scott, about ullage, and the way that you handle ullage in a regular rocket stage, when you want to resettle propellants for another burn, you have gas and liquid sloshing around in there, is you have the ullage motors fire up and the gas and the liquid separate, and you have the liquid at the bottom again, and then you can fire. For the Starship stack, this is actually a bit more of a problem, because what they have is what's called autogenous pressurization, which means that you use the same propellant, a gaseous form of the same propellant that you're burning, both in the methane tank and the oxygen tank, to fill up that space. So if you think about, liquid and gas phases, it's basically the difference between liquid and gas is pressure, right? For a given temperature, if you increase pressure, you can generally liquefy gas, and if you release pressure enough, then any liquid is going to turn into gas. So how do you get liquid and gas to coexist? If you have it near its boiling point, then if you have the temperature and pressure basically right at the boiling point, you can have gas and liquid coexist. But SpaceX likes to have subcooled propellant, which means that the liquid is closer to its freezing point, right? And that has a number of benefits. It's denser. You get higher performance engines. You can spin your turbo pumps faster. You're not going to get cavitation. You're not as likely to get cavitation. But that also means that if you mix the gas and the liquid, then it's going to cause the gas to collapse. It's going to condense, or it's going to drop in temperature dramatically. Oh, and the other thing is that because they don't want the residual gas to be too heavy, because every kilogram of that is wasted mass, right? That impacts the performance. You want that as light as possible. They're actually planning on pressurizing it with fairly hot gas coming from the engines. It's not exhaust gas, but it's like preheated propellant that's at about 600 Kelvin. Now your propellant is at around 100 Kelvin, and that's approximately, actually maybe it's a little bit lower than that, and that's around when you have that gas liquid transition. So if you mix that liquid with that gas, then all that gas starts to either cool down, and you have a major loss of pressure, or even worse, to condense, and you have an even more dramatic loss of pressure. And then you have to repressurize that space, but you have a bunch of cold gas in there. So then you need fairly heavy COPV gas tanks full of maybe 300 Kelvin methane and oxygen to try to pump back in and bring up that pressure. So that has a big performance impact. So you really never want to have that in the main tanks of the super heavy after you've done a burn, and it's mostly gas, if you want to use those tanks again. Does that make sense? Did I go too fast?
Yes. So in summary, what's going on is that so long as you keep a lot of pressure in there, obviously keeping a gas really cold, it's going to condense. But another way to keep it as a liquid is to keep it under a lot of pressure. And as you start to take the pressure off, it starts to boil, and you get the problem with boil off, and now you've kind of lost some other stuff. But you also have to worry about the fact that you've got the ullage, the fact that you're consuming it. Now you have more empty space to fill, which means it's kind of encouraging boil off. So you want to keep on increasing the pressure. And as we know, if I take this thing right now, it's kind of under pressure. And so long as I keep it under pressure, it's going to be fine. But as soon as I release that, whoa, everything kind of comes off. So that's basically the same idea, is we want to keep that thing under pressure so those gases are not wanting to convert into, or let's say the liquid's not going to convert into gaseous form. That's one thing. And then of course the other is to push it down. So you have to pressurize it to keep it in that form. And at the same time, you have to make sure that, when it's upside down, that this stuff is going towards the engines and that the empty space is away where you want it to be. And what I think the reason I don't know if they don't have ullage motors on the first stage. Is that correct? Or they don't want to have ullage motors?
So they don't want to have ullage motors. That's one thing. Yep. But they do have venting. And they
they have the boil off venting. Yes.
Yeah,
they have that. But the problem is, if they don't have ullage motors, they can't restart.
So with the venting, if you keep it venting, then you can potentially. So if you keep it venting, you can definitely restart, right? You're drawing gas from the top, and if you're pushing it down, you keep as long as you have enough thrust, you can keep the liquid settled. But if you do unsettle your propellant, then you have ullage collapse in a way that you don't when you have helium pressurization, because helium is not going to condense on you, and it's already around the temperature of your liquid. So what SpaceX is trying to do is to have the gas and the liquid form of the methane and the oxygen at two very different temperatures. So that's the thing that makes it extra important for those two to not mix. If you mix them in something else, in a helium pressurized stage, you can separate it with ullage thrust. You can have a little settling burn. Now, with the venting, what you're going to have is you're in vacuum, right? So even if those mix and you're drawing maybe a mixture of liquid and gas from the top, you don't know what's going to come, you still have a little bit of residual pressure. So when you dump it, that's going to expand into gas, and it's going to give you some thrust. It may not be very efficient, but if you vent, even if you have liquid that you're sucking in, you're going to be able to restart. But
basically, it's like a scuba tank. You open up a scuba tank and stuff comes spraying on out. You're going to get a little bit of thrust.
Right.
And you don't need a whole lot of thrust.
You don't need a whole lot of thrust.
Yes.
But the problem is that you end up if you let those mix, you end up cooling your gas and potentially condensing it, such that the pressure drops dramatically, and then you need a whole lot more gas that has to come from somewhere in order to bring the pressure back up to the inlet pressure of the Raptors, which are relatively high, it seems. And the other thing is that in this process, you haven't just dropped your pressure, you've also warmed up your liquid, which also increases the chances of cavitation in the engine.
Yes. You want to keep it cold. So the main thing is that in order to do the startup, you have to make sure you deal with the ullage. Yeah. And if you don't turn off the engines, you don't have to worry about that problem, because you'll constantly have the thrusting, and they need to have the boost back burn.
Right.
So they don't want to shut it. So I think part of the reason for doing this is because of the boost back burn. If they didn't have the boost back burn, they probably would not need to do hot staging.
Probably not.
Yeah, probably not. Now, so if we go back to the charts that that Clinton Joy had, he was showing the different scenarios of like when they light things up and whether they're going to shut things down and everything else. And I think, one of the scenarios he thought is that they might shut down the first stage and then light up the second one. But then that kind of is like, well, that defeats the whole purpose of the whole thing, because now you're going to have ullage collapse. So it has to continue on. Yeah. Right. And
you also have some degree of ullage collapse in the second stage as well. But the amount of space that you have at the top of those tanks is fairly small. We're talking about single-digit percentage of the total volume in there. So it's not nearly as hard to repressurize the second stage. It's not nearly as much of a performance set to repressurize the second stage as it is to repressurize the first stage.
Yes, the first stage becomes tricky. So you're trying to do that separation, and you're trying to do it in such a way that when you separate, it doesn't come back. Yeah. And that's really the danger. And
also, you don't push the first stage down so much that
which goes the other way. You could over-thrust it. Exactly. You could defeat the whole thing. Is the blowback could be so much that it can't handle it. So that's why they're trying to say, well, when we start up the vacuum wraps, do we do 100% or do we do 60%? And if we don't calculate that blowback right, this thing's going to come back the other way. So that's why we're saying they have to model that thing right, because we've tried to model it and we're like, I'm not quite so sure how this works, but we're just doing Excel spreadsheets. So that's one thing. They have something more sophisticated. And then, the other thing is that which engines do you think? Because there's a debate. Are they going to do 3? Are they going to do 6? And if they're doing 3, is it inside or outside? I mean, Ellie, ask your audience, what do they think when they do the hot staging? How many engines?
I haven't been able to talk for a little bit, so let me interject for a second.
Sure.
Please do.
Thank Dr. Vince for the super chat. He says, thanks for the educational podcast on this topic. So thank you for super chatting. It really helps keep my channel afloat. And Ross has another question. Here's a thought. Do you think the engine tests at McGregor fired against the steel plate were to test the hot staging shielding as well as the water-cooled steel plate under the OLM?
So, I think that was a sea level Raptor, right?
Yeah.
And it was a water-cooled plate, right? They had the same, steam coming out of, water jets turning into steam coming out of that plate, which is not what we are seeing with the hot staging ring. They don't seem to have water going into that space. So I think if you're lighting up the Raptor vacuum engines, then it's not going to give you the same information about whether the nozzles can handle the pressure rise. And if you're, either way, whether you're lighting sea level Raptors or vacuum Raptors, it's not going to give you a lot of information about what the steel plate is going to handle, because it's a totally different scenario where you're squirting water out of those little nozzles.
So this is a steel plate they're putting in there, and my first impression when I looked at it is I said, man, they must be expecting some blowback, because when you look at all the ribbing on there to protect what is the heat shielding above that.
Yep.
And then I considered a bit more. It's like, well, wait a minute. It might be they need more cross bracing for the top of the booster, because you've got kind of a big empty space along there. Do you think that is for the blowback, or you think it is also for the fact that you need to now worry about the sideways loading?
So I think that's for the blowback.
Okay.
If you look at that external ring and the dome, I mean, where that attaches is the ring, right? So that ring has to bear the full compressive load, and it's already ribbed pretty well for its height.
Yeah.
To bear that load. So if it's not gonna yield from the compression, then it's probably not gonna buckle.
Okay, because I'm just thinking, if you take like the top of the can, that's there, and you extend this ring out. So if I was to cut the top of this can off, it would be really flimsy, and I would want some sort of structural support in there. That's that. So it's probably dual purpose. The question is which is the greater loading that they're worried about? The radial loading or the axial loading?
That ring structure, apart from the dome, looks thickly enough ribbed to not worry about axial loading. Not need extra stiffening for axial loading. And it doesn't even, where you have the biggest problem is near the top, right? Where you don't have, I mean, that dome does not help with the top at all, right? It just keeps the bottom from folding in, but it's already attached to super heavy at that point, right? So I don't think that dome is doing much for that axial compression. I think what that's for is for the blowback. And one thing to keep in mind is that when you fire those engines, that's going to heat up the steel, and if my math is right, it's going to heat up the steel quite a bit. Not to, you can keep it below the point of failure, but it's going to heat it up enough that the steel is likely to soften up and lose some strength. So that ribbing is probably spaced enough that, spaced far enough apart that you're going to get pretty decent strength,
right?
Even when the dome itself loses some stiffness.
Now, this is kind of what we expect the configuration to look like. So this is about 2 meters here, and this is like all kind of eyeballed. So the dimensions could be off a little bit, but this is about what the size of the inboard Raptors are going to look like, the sea level Raptors and the Raptors out here. So looking at this, which engines do you think are going to be the ones to light up?
I know what I would light.
Yeah.
I would light up the RVACs. Initially, I didn't think that they would, like, before I saw that dome, I thought that they would be lighting up the sea level Raptors, because if one of them goes out, you still have attitude control.
Exactly. That's what I'm worried about.
But with the RVACs, you have to light them up at the same time and keep them, use differential thrust to keep it straight. Make sure that they stay even. You don't have gimbal to help you out, and they're relatively outboard, so you get even, if one of them thrusts too much, then you get bigger amount of.
Yep.
But if you're sure of being able to light up the sea level Raptors shortly after you separate, you're probably not going to get enough rotation, even with a little bit of a timing mismatch, that it's going to be too big of a problem.
The only thing is the acceleration differential between the two. If one of those RVACs goes out, they're going to have to shut down one of the stages. Yeah. They're going to have to shut down one of the Raptors on the first stage. They have to do that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think that you need the RVEX to see. This can go really bad, badly wrong if you lose one of those RVEX.
Yeah. So I hope everyone understands why Ozan and I say that this can go sideways quickly.
Well,
Is that
and we have a couple more super chats coming in. So thank you,
Okay.
Al, for the super chat. And he says, time to put you both on the spot. What are you giving for the chances of a successful orbital flight with hot staging on the next Starship test flight?
okay? I've got a spreadsheet for that. We'll get to it. Okay.
I'll just say my rough estimate now is about 50%.
Yeah, and I have kind of a breakdown that we can kind of do a nice wrap on that. But the first thing that has to happen is that all these have to light up, and they have to light up reasonably close. So if one of them is taking a little bit more time, the question is, do you still keep them on there with the risk that you're going to overheat the thing, or can the heat shields last more than 3 seconds? Can they endure, say, 10 seconds? The reason to use the RWRAPs or the RVEX, I should say, is that you are kind of starting to get into the thin part of the atmosphere. So these should perform better than the sea level. So you're getting that extra thrust to get away. So that's an argument. And the other, of course, is like there's just more room for this to go. And finally, the exhaust is actually expanded more than this has. So in some sense, you don't have quite as much of a pressure differential coming out as you would with the sea levels within here. So it might be actually a little bit easier to vent out. And of course, it's just already closer to the outside. There's more room for it to expand and everything else. So that's what it looks like.
And the heat loads are a lot better too on the RVEX.
Right. The other potential alternative here is that we could go and say, well, what if you gimbal right away at 15 degrees? Now we're not sure if it can actually do 15 degrees, but if you do that, and depending upon whether I model this thing right, you still get a little bit of impingement over here. The question is, with that 15, does it just kind of slide right down there and work? And of course, it could be that my diameter is completely wrong. If it's a bit thinner, maybe they gimbal it out and they run it that way. Maybe they run all 6 of them this way. Who knows? There are possibilities, but I don't think so. And the other, of course, is in the future, they're going to have this. They are going to have all 9. And we can see that when they have all 9, depending on how good my math is and the separation of everything, I'm not sure you can gimbal at 15 degrees, but it depends if I get my gimbal point right. Well, you could potentially have those.
We have another question for Ozan from Tin Man. Thank you again for the super chat. He wants to know, would small inverted thrusters firing at the time of hot stage benefit by pushing down on the booster's ability to not double tap the ship?
Sorry. I just noticed my battery's running low, so I'm going to need to get my charger.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, if I can, I just don't want this to
go ahead. We don't want to lose you.
Yeah, I'll get that. So I think it's, so again, it was like some extra thrusters to make sure there isn't the double tap. I think there are RCS thrusters. Ozan can double check on this because there's been some debate on whether there's RCS thrusters everywhere or not. I think certainly Starship must have them because if it's in orbit, you need to have an RCS system. So that could be used to give a little bit of forward impetus. I'm not sure if Super Heavy does. Again, I think it's one of those things they're kind of trying to get rid of as much as possible on that to prevent that. And what they have might only be in some select directions because between the gimbling and between the grid fins, you should be able to get enough flight control since you're primarily running in the atmosphere. So you just have to double check that. But yeah, I mean, I think like with everything, you need to have a backup in case something fails. So what do you do if one of the RVACs doesn't light? Or if you're only getting partial performance, what are all the things that they're going to have to do to make sure they still have a successful flight? And the last thing is, with looking at this, I kind of wondered why they hadn't considered this design, what I call the Jello mold version, where instead of making it a truncated cone, whether you do something like this to help with the venting, because it just seems really crammed in there. And there could be a variety of reasons. One, maybe it's just really hard to put the ribbing in for it. It's a bit more complex. There could be a variety of reasons. Maybe it has something to do with the controlling the blowback. They prefer the other design. So there's probably some reason they went conical, and they know better.
I can hypothesize about that, but I want to
Yeah.
answer Tin Man's question. So I think that what Tin Man is saying is inverted thrusters on the first stage. Is that right?
Yeah.
To kind of
Well,
keep the
he
first stage
says
down.
the thrusters would be on the booster, not the
Yeah.
ship.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would help, but I mean, at that point, really, what you can do is just take down the booster from 3 to 2 engines.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's a simpler. It's a fairly simple thing to do. I mean, you can take it down to 1, 2 gets you a little bit of redundancy, 3 gets you a little more.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know why they chose 3, because it makes. So I think the only good reason, in my opinion, but I'm not SpaceX. I'm sure they know better than me. But the best reason I can think of to have 3 Raptors lit on the first stage is so that you can get enough thrust on the first stage that you can light 3 on the second stage.
Yes. Yeah. The other, yeah, you have to gimbal kind of crazy, because now suddenly if you shut down 2 of those vacs, you are a little bit out of alignment, and you've got to do something in order to keep the vehicle straight. So it makes your steering a bit more complex if you only have 1 of those. But yeah, you're right. They could go back down to 1, and it must be they're going with 3 because they're anticipating that's the amount of blowback they need to push against. And if something happens, they could shut down 1 of them quick enough to make sure they don't bump it. And you're right, they could still run at 1 if they're thrusting forward, if they're not being pushed backwards, and you don't have ullage collapse or anything else.
Yeah.
And then you could light them back up, because
Right.
everything is now. What's the light up sequence?
As far as I know, they're planning to light up 13 and have 13 engines firing for the boost back burn. Like,
so then they end up going through it. So yeah. So
Yeah.
how easy is it to light up? Because I know, do they need to use T-tab or anything else, or they're not having to use anything like that, right?
No, it's either spark ignition or just the gases are hot enough that they will auto.
Oh, okay, so it's almost as easy as just starting up your car, just boom, and that's it. It's nothing really fancy. Whereas it's a bit more involved, I guess you could say, with the Merlin engines, because you need to make sure you have enough for the T-tab to be able to ignite everything. So you want to minimize the number of startups you can have as much as possible. So the only thing is just making sure they're getting the thrust to make sure that you really can start it up. As long as you have that, everything should be easy. Yeah. Okay, so it sparks really easy. The other thing is
Ellie still on?
Yeah, she probably had to catch something, but as far as I was looking at the ribs, what they were for. Yeah, so we've kind of talked about that. The 3 clamps, the truncated cone. Any other notes or thoughts?
Michael's question about which engine will initiate hot staging. That's one of the things that we don't know. We suspect the Raptor, the RVACs, but
the RVACs, yep, the outer ones.
The RVACs make more sense to us. That you could argue either way.
But you could argue this so many different ways, and again, that's what it kind of came down to.
I'm prepared to be surprised. I'll say that.
Yes. What is the right way now? So the nuance is we got to make sure the stages don't bump into each other. So you've got to control the thrusting on both sides just right. You've got to calculate how much blowback you're going to have versus the thrust that you actually get. You need to make sure your trajectory does not get compromised doing that. And again, we sort of talked about that. You gain some things from it, but what you gain, you've kind of lost by the fact you have to add this other ring in there. This other ring also adds, I think, a dynamic problem as well, because I don't know how more flexible that structure suddenly becomes because of that ring, and whether it's going to be stiff enough. So you now suddenly made it a little bit longer. I don't know if it's going to introduce any weird aerodynamic drag.
Loads.
Yeah,
almost certainly.
Yes. So that's the thing I'm kind of worried about, is that it's very easy to kind of collapse with this kind of thing, a torsional load like that. And that's why they have those X's in there to try to prevent that from happening. But that's the thing I'm most concerned about. However, I don't really see where you would be normally getting a lot of torsional loading like that. It's not like you got 2 things out there really doing that.
Yeah,
it has to be able to sustain some, but there shouldn't be anything great. The problem is if it starts to collapse,
load will also increase.
Yeah, I think this way the compression, I think we'll be able to hold that okay. A little bit of concern, but I think it's enough. It's mainly the torsional load, but again, there's enough cross bracing. It looks like it will be okay. I don't know if you're going to get weird drag, because now suddenly you have something that's just, more than likely everything is just going to pass by it as if it's not there. In the worst case, they could always shrink wrap it, just because that doesn't have any mass. Because
Right.
I know when they light it up, boom, that shrink wrap is going to be gone. So
And drag is a relatively small part of
it's, in the
any
grand
rocket
scheme,
launch,
it's so
any
small.
large rocket launch, but especially for Starship, that
Yes,
thing is so huge that
you don't notice it.
it's yeah.
And you're going so slow through this thicker part of the atmosphere, it doesn't matter. And when you start picking up speed, at that point, the density has dropped so much, it doesn't really matter either.
Right.
So they'll probably be okay. Now, I have my little scorecard for what I think is going to happen the next launch. Since there was that question.
Yes.
So, Ellie, I'm going to ask you, here's what I'm going through, what I think are the milestones. And we can all come up with our own. So the first one is all 33 Raptors ignite.
Okay.
What do you put that at?
Like 80%.
All 33 light on the pad.
Maybe like an 80% chance.
I'm going a little bit higher.
Okay.
I think I'll put it at about 95%, because I think they will have worked out, not quite 100%, but I think there's a 95% at least all 33 will light.
Okay, we got some guesses. Al is very, he says 5%. Yeah. James says 75%. So
yeah. So I mean, I'm probably on the high side for a lot, but
Yeah.
I'm going with that. Now, of course, the last test was pretty
80%.
bad. They lost 4. What do you think, Ozan?
I'd go with about 80%. I think that's
okay. So you're 80. So I'm really pretty high on that.
As far as we know, right? We lost. They 4 failed to light on the last one, and the hypothesis, the speculation is that they replaced those 4, right?
Yeah, it had something to do with the QD, with the quick disconnects or something like that. So I think they were all related. So I don't think
each one has about a 95% chance of. Oh, you think it had to do with the QD, not the engine?
Yeah,
itself?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, in that case, then it might be higher than 80%.
That's why I'm thinking is that it's going to be like, 90, 95%. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Now, as far as liftoff, because remember, liftoff, we can have no more than 3 outs. Yeah. So I will say that there's 99% chance that they will actually be able to lift off. They'll have enough Raptors live that they will be able to lift off.
And I just want to be clear that you do have enough thrust to weight to lift off with way fewer than 30 Raptors, but they probably have some safety built in so that if you lose more along the way, they and I think that it's programmed to take off at about 90% thrust, so you don't lose that liftoff profile if you lose up to 3 engines. You can throttle up to catch up.
But basically their shutdown procedure is that if they lose 4, they don't release and they shut everything down. Now then, as far as no pad damage.
0.
Oh man,
well, I think no significant pad damage. Let me put it that way.
30%, 20, 25.
Oh, really? You think that? But I think they'll do okay.
Define significant.
Significant means that you have to do significant repairs to be able to use it again. If there's something that probably
75%.
A service door has a problem or something like that. I think they'll have like really very small pad damage. Yeah. If everything goes away, if they rud, yes, you've got a major problem. But assuming the launch goes clear, I think that deluge system will do enough to protect the pad. Yeah. That it's like, oh yeah, the paint job's going to get scuffed and stuff like that. But basically, if it went well and said, okay, we're ready to launch next week, that it's like mostly ready to launch, and there might be a few minor things that they have to take care of. So I'm pretty sure that's going to be all right. Now, once it does that, it launches. I think clearing the tower should be like 99%.
Yeah.
Once they're released, they should clear the tower, and it should remain vertical. Because remember last time, it was a little bit crooked.
It was nuts.
Right. Then the question is, how many engine outs do you think they'll have on the way up?
At least one.
Yeah.
At least one.
Yeah, it seems like so it's like 95% chance that there's 0 engine outs. It's just like you almost are going to have 1 or 2 go.
Yeah.
So most people, so you're going to lose 1. It's very, very little chance that you're going to have 0 out. However, I don't think that hurts whether they're able to maintain the nominal trajectory. So I'm pretty hopeful that if they make it past there, that they will be able to stick to their nominal trajectory profile, which means, not just the course that they want to have, but also the speed and acceleration. They hit all those milestones. And then they should be able to make it to and through max Q with, greater than 90% chance.
Yeah.
Then we come to hot staging. Okay, so what are the chances of hot staging being a fully successful?
I think if they make it that far, maybe about 70 to 80%.
Yeah, I got about 75% that maybe the hot staging goes. Now, the thing is defining what's successful hot staging, and I think you have to break it down between the booster and the Starship. So within the hot staging, I'll say 75% chance of it being successful. In other words, we don't have a rut or anything bad, but maybe a 50% chance that the ring survives.
Yeah.
Yeah. About a 90% chance that the booster kind of makes it through it without any issues. And of course, a 90% chance that the grid fins also survive. Because remember, the grid fins are pretty close. You lose that ring, you might compromise the fins. If they make it through, then the chance of a soft splashdown, what do you think?
Ooh, they need to relight those Raptors at just the right time, and if they
need the grid fins operating.
Yeah, and they need. So if they're planning on no ullage collapse.
Yep.
And I kind of want to get back to that because I want to throw a monkey wrench in this whole hot staging thing, which is that you could get the same performance without hot staging. There is a way. There are multiple ways to do this. Secondary tanks, having a little bit of ullage, a little bit of cold gas thrust or hot, gas RCS thrusters firing through the staging event, and having the booster rotate out of the way. There are ways to get the same performance, and that's what confuses me about this. But I would probably give it about a 50% chance of a soft splashdown. I don't know, maybe a little, like if it makes it through the staging event, maybe higher than 50% chance of a soft splashdown.
That's what I'm thinking is if we don't have any disaster at the hot staging, then I would say, 80-90% chance that the soft landing works. But if we have any damage there, see, that's why I say, well, it's down, to 80% because there's a 20% chance that something kind of happens to the overall system. It doesn't work. Now, with the hot staging, it could be the disaster is behind the Starship. So the Starship comes out completely unscathed. And that's also questionable because I always wonder, the idea of like lighting up those Raptors inside an enclosed area, even if that vents out right, whether that's even a good idea on whether it compromises that whole thing. But assuming that it comes out of that intact, I think once you're through there, you have absolutely no problem with making it to orbit. I think at that point, they can press to orbit and they'll be okay.
Now, Scott, this might be a question for you. I don't know if you know the answer, but Cosmic Madge wants to know, could either of you break down the etymology of the word, I think, ullage is what they mean.
Ullage. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think that's mage, cosmic mage. So a mage is a sorcerer. Okay. So it's not spelled ullage. It's ullage. It's ULLAGE.
There you go. Daryl.
Technically, ullage means kind of the empty space. This is what you call the ullage. It's what's left over. And as you can see, the phone's ringing, so just give me 1 second. I'll be right back.
Oh, all right. Well, Ozone, it's up to you and I to.
Yeah, so I think Scott was going over probabilities of this making it through. One thing that I wanted to address that I remember somebody asking to have covered on this chat is the question of how much does that ring weigh? Like the hot staging ring. Mm-hmm. And obviously, we don't know, but if it's made out of millimeter thick steel, and if it didn't have ribbing, and if there were no holes in the side, it would be about 4 tons. So if you had that shape and it was perfectly solid with no ribbing, and made of 4 millimeter steel, it would be about 4 tons. So with all of the ribbing, I would expect it to be somewhere in the 5 to 10 ton range, probably closer to 5 tons. It might be 6 tons.
Cool. And Scott, did you get an answer?
Oh, an answer on?
Or do you have an answer for the ullage question?
Oh, the empty space.
It's the empty space.
Okay. But like the
It's
etymology.
Etymology.
Oh, the etymology. It's probably Latin. Yeah. Now that we know the spelling right, we know how to look it up. But yeah, it's pretty much. I think it's like what's left over, the empty part. A glass half ullage is a glass half full. I don't know, something like that. There's probably some saying.
I just expect you to know the answer to everything. But here's another question for you. Thank you, Thomas, for the super chat on this Monday. How is the sliding takeoff being mitigated?
So if you don't have engines going out, then
Yeah.
you're not going to be able. So the reason for the sliding takeoff is that if you lose thrust on one side, in order to keep going up, you kind of have to gimbal the Raptors, and that kind of pushes you out in the other direction. You just kind of have to. You want to fire through the center of mass, right?
Yeah.
To keep from rotating, but in order to fire through the center of mass and not go sideways, you need to rotate the booster if your thrust is off axis, which is going to be if you lose some of the engines. So the mitigation is to not lose engines.
Yeah,
but if you don't
otherwise
lose too many engines, you can.
Yeah.
If you don't lose too many engines, you can do a little bit of that tilt and still take off.
Yeah, basically what's happening is that everything's going to be pushing up here. You're going to be pushing here and pushing here. But if you suddenly lose thrust here, suddenly it kind of falls that way, right? But you don't want the booster leaning that way. You'd like to straighten it out. The only way to straighten it out is you had the engines in the middle, which you could gimbal. So they're like pointing off over this way to try to bring it off that way. But now the problem is you've got a thrust vector that way, which is why it appears to go slide sideways, even though it should be going straight up. And the other way to think of it is like if you're driving down the road in the wintertime and one of your tires hits ice and the other one is on pavement, of course, your car decides to veer to one way because now the thrust vector is no longer the same going through that. And yeah, I'm glad he called that the sliding, because I called that like it's going to basically come vertical off the pad. And it was vertical off the pad, but it was doing that weird thing. So thanks for reminding me, Thomas, that it was more of a sliding takeoff.
Yeah, that there's a video that I saw on the Mexico side, right? Because you can watch the Starship launch from either South Padre Island or, obviously not in the exclusion zone, but some of those folks on the Mexico side were very close, and someone captured, I want to find the video. It's just, very up close seeing that lean, and, people are like screaming in Spanish, and it was, I'll try to find that video. It was pretty crazy to see.
Yeah. It's and of course what ended up happening is that they weren't like 3 random outs, because if they were kind of like randomly distributed, they probably would have had no problem, but they were kind of to one side.
Right.
And that's what made it a little bit worse. It was even more off axis.
Right. I'm gonna try to see. Yeah, I'll have to find that. It was pretty good. We are getting some more questions, like a lot of questions. So
good.
I don't know if we want to just start going down the list. Thank you guys for being so active, asking questions. Okay, so Ross wants to know how will SpaceX determine how successful the vented interstage ring design is, given that Booster 9 will splash down in the Gulf of Mexico and won't be recovered?
Which
they
is
probably
surprising.
Have cameras.
Yeah.
And probably either Starlink or something else to send.
Yeah, basically, I think the answer is telemetry. Yeah.
Well. Telemetry,
yeah. So there will be some telemetry. It's a shame they wouldn't attempt to go out and recover it, because if they don't, I'm sure someone else will.
Yeah.
It's not that deep in the Gulf of Mexico, so you can retrieve. I assume where it's going to be going down is not in any trench. So I think it would be possible.
Yep.
And the thing is, it's possible to make the ring survive. you can either have a disposable ring, which I'm sure they won't want to have in a long term, or you can make sure that the ring survives pretty well, and it's within known physics to be able to do that with known materials, and you can probably do it with either entire, all steel or mostly steel. There's some bits. So the tricky thing with the ring is that when you have impinging exhaust on the structures of that ring, basically the smaller those structures are, the more likely, like the higher the heat flux, because you get this boundary layer when the gas hits the structure and it slows down, and you get this sort of blanket. And the smaller the structure is, the thinner that boundary layer, and the higher the rate of heat flow into that structure. And if it's too high, then you're going to overheat the material. And for steel, we're kind of pushing the limits of the thermal conductivity of that as well. So you can't just protect it if it's hot enough. Sorry, if the heat flow is high enough, then you can't protect it by just making it thicker. You're going to get erosion. That's it. So some of those, like around the vents, some of those structures are small enough that I worry a little bit about the heat load. But if my estimations are right, it should survive for a few seconds of full thrust. And the dome even longer than that.
Right.
10 seconds of full thrust, assuming you're firing the RVACs. If you're firing the sea level Raptors, you have a little less time.
So yeah, that's the question, is whether it's designed to last for like 30 seconds or 3 seconds of that. And we don't know what is the startup sequence. It's usually about 3 seconds for the Raptors, at least on the ground. What do you think it would be in the staging event?
To spin them? I mean, you could always prime them before. So
they're spun up, but as soon as you light them, how long before you think you have enough thrust that you can release the clamps?
Full thrust. I think from the landing burns of Starship, we saw those go from 0 to 90 in a fraction of a second.
Yeah. So it may be that they're released really quick.
Yeah.
And
I would expect it to be.
I mean, the whole thing is that you can spin up a Raptor pretty quick.
Yeah. And
it will go. The thing is making sure all three of them spin up simultaneously, that you don't have something that slows one of them down.
No.
So they probably want to work out something that they know it's like, bam, we do that. And that's like a half second. And then they get enough thrust and then they release. And then it's like that heat shield is like, well, I didn't see anything. It happened so fast.
Now, Scott, I found the video from the Mexico side. So I'm going to play it.
Great.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So it wasn't vertical either. Power slide. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a pretty good video.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
And the thing is that it's kind of lucky that the engines that were out on the side, the correct side, because if it decided to do it the other direction, it goes right into Methuselah. Yeah.
Well,
it's interesting though that they didn't. I mean, they could have gimbaled. They could have corrected that sooner with gimbal.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that they kept it going at that angle. That's why I originally thought that it was an intentional early pitch maneuver.
Yeah, me too. I kind of thought like, oh, I guess that was part of the program. I wasn't expecting that.
imagine being that close. That's just insane. I was like,
are they closer?
I mean,
yeah, I think they are.
That looks pretty close.
Because it's what?
6
miles to South Padre, right?
Yeah. Yes, around 6. And then I was even a little bit further at Margaritaville on the roof.
And I mean, they could have been less than 3 miles. The order of 3 miles.
Yeah. Good. Well, I mean, like, I know they're probably zoomed in, but like, look at these people too in front of them. They're like right there.
Then there's the question of whether the Mexican authorities also are like, no, we got to keep these people back,
Yeah.
So, or whether there's a free for all, like, whatever.
This little, there's like a little bit of a movement here. Do you think that person's like freaked out or something, or they're just? I wonder what that was about.
Yeah, I don't think the shock would have hit them yet.
Ah, interesting. Well, some people, this is the first time they're seeing this angle. So yeah, I saw this on TikTok of
Yeah.
all places, and I thought it was pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Now, to give you an idea of blowback, Tim Dodd he found the Titan II launcher. So this whole idea of hot staging is not new. It's been around in that evidently, remember the Soviet N1? It had hot staging.
yeah.
Now, I'm not sure how successful the hot staging was because they had, 2 failures? And I'm not sure if it was like before or after, or at least might have made it through one of the stages, but I had a couple that were set up that way. And somewhere I've got some images of that we can use to take a look at. And if I just remember how to share again, get the StreamYard over here. And we can kind of take a look at a couple examples that are here.
Well, and I also want to say thanks for another super chat from Little Trucker Kennel Miniature Pinchers. Eat more beans. SpaceX needs methane.
Yeah.
One way to source it.
That's one way. Yep.
Okay, so we're switching.
So here's the Soviet N1, and you can see, basically the venting area they have here. So they have these struts in here that were used for that rocket to be able to do hot staging.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, the Soyuz, which is the most launched rocket of all time, or launch vehicle of all time, also uses hot staging.
Oh, okay, yeah. And then the Gemini, Titan, also used hot staging, which you can kind of see there in that close up. Now, the Saturn V did not use hot staging, and it used this ring here. And what you see around here are the ullage motors on that interstage ring, and then you can kind of see that this is what happens when you start to impinge the exhaust of 5 J2 engines, and off over here. So we're kind of familiar with this particular sequence that's out there. Now, somewhere in here, let me go ahead and make sure I find it. Is I do have the video from Tim.
And while you're looking for that, thank you, Bimmer Geezer, for joining. He says, sorry I'm late, but with a very generous super chat. And he says, let's hope Starship 2 isn't 8:31. I think he's saying that because he knows I'll be in Spain Thursday until September 1st. So I don't think it's going to happen 8:31. But thank you for joining and super chatting as always.
Okay, so this is the Titan. So what we just looked at for the Gemini Titan, remember, it has that kind of ring in there. And so here's an example of the hot staging going on there. And you can see that ring, and it seems it's holding up. And now I've had enough. So I'm surprised it didn't go sooner. So that's exactly what hot staging would look like in the forces of the blowback that we're trying to deal with.
Did you just show a video?
Yeah. Are you seeing it?
Only at the Saturn V.
We didn't see it.
Oh, you still have the Saturn V. Oh.
No, sounded like you were talking about a video. We see it.
Yeah, so I thought the video would be showing right now. Let me go ahead and try to present again. For some reason, I thought it was telling it to show the window, but it looks like it doesn't want to show the window. Let me see. Share screen. Let me go ahead and do this again. Entire screen. There we go. Share it. Found it. Okay, here we go.
Oh, wow.
So again, it's the Titan booster.
Whoa.
Okay. Ozan, you hadn't seen that yet?
No, I saw it when Tim posted it.
Okay. Yeah, so it gives you an idea of what it's going to look like. Potentially, and whether now it may be that this ring
shouldn't look like that, but
it shouldn't look like that. It could be the ring is just purely disposable. It just serves its purpose and say, look, the whole thing is an expendable vehicle. We don't care.
Yeah.
So what's different with what's going on in this case is it's the first time hot staging with a reusable booster, and that's why it brings in all these questions on whether it's going to survive, the survivability of the rings, and whether it does enough protection. But you see, in this case, the rest of the booster stage seems to be fine. But then again, that's only one single engine.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, theoretically,
Whoa.
it should stay within. I mean, for the dome, you shouldn't even get structural damage. Like
Yes.
if you get the steel too hot, it'll permanently lose some strength. But if they do this the way that I expect they will, then if everything goes right and the models that I'm looking at are not wrong, then the steel should heat up to a temperature below the point where it turns to putty.
So yeah, it should be okay. And yeah, I don't expect that there's going to be, the question is you've got the steel dome and whether that's going to survive. And then you have
Right.
the vents themselves. And
Yep.
I would think
The
that
vents are a little bit
once-
more iffy, but
yeah, my concern is like, do the vents blow out before you finish staging?
yeah,
And,
I think
that
what
would
you're
be bad
likely to
because
get
now,
is erosion.
yeah, yes, you don't have the, you no longer have the connection, which means they're no longer thrusting. And that's when it's a disaster scenario. Once you get the staging, there's probably a very small window in there where they're really dealing with a lot. But the further you get away, the easier it is. Because at that
Yeah.
point, you don't have something that's more explosive trying to deal with it because you've got now the top is available to kind of vent out. So once it makes it
the
through
heat
that,
loads go down.
oh,
You
the
know,
heat
as-
loads go down really quick.
Yeah.
And then the pressure loads also go down. So,
Right.
and then erosion and everything else will kind of change. So a lot of the venting won't happen through the vents anymore. It's going to happen off somewhere else. But
Right.
before, it's trying to contain that thing, which really, I mean, literally is an explosion that's going on in there. And whether you're able to vent that thing out fast enough to prevent it from literally being an explosive force.
Well,
Yeah.
Scott, with that video that you just showed us, Ducey wants to know, how did they get the footage if the rocket is expendable?
Okay, so it's like the same thing with the Saturn V. That was, I think they have the footage on that, and that's the second stage of the Saturn V. And they either recover it or I think they ejected it out and then it was recovered later on.
Wow.
So they had like a camera that was on there. And because again, this is shooting like 35 millimeter. It was like back in the 60s. And then they probably had some way to be able to do it. Now, not all the Saturn V's had it. That was like an engineering test. I think the very first Saturn V, and they wanted to get as much data to see what was going on. And so they had some ways of being able to recover it. So yeah, the booster ended up who knows where in the middle of the Atlantic, but I think they had like a small payload that they would then eject and be able to recover, which would have been the same because that's how a lot of spy satellites worked in the 60s. Is they were going around taking all sorts of pictures, and then those pictures were then literally ejected and then have to get recovered somewhere else. And you had these airplanes that would be flying through with these big hooks that would actually catch these parts of these satellites that were coming back with the precious data. And that's what was being done during the Cold War. And there was a really great, I think it was a Clive Cussler movie about that. I think it was called Ice Station Zebra or something like that, where it was like a battle between the Soviets and the Americans to get what was something that came down from a satellite somewhere that had like really good spy footage. So that's how it used to be.
Somehow the aliens have gotten a hold of the US dollar. Thank you for the super chat. And someone needs a ride back to their other planet. And also, thank you, Ross. He says this is the best deep dive I've heard yet on hot staging. So thank you to both of you for having this conversation and educating a lot of us here in the chat. I don't want to keep Ozon too long because I think you're on a time frame.
I can go a little longer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, how about some final questions here, or let's see. So
again, thank you to Ross. I mean, we really wanted to dedicate this just to hot staging because we could see in our tweet threads that there was a lot of interest and a lot of questions, open questions, even questions that we have about what's going on. And the expectations coming up, is it going to work or not going to work? It seems like a great idea on paper, but when you look at the details, there's a lot of sleepless nights. Definitely.
Well, and I really like, Scott, you and I have done several live streams and we do tend to talk about, 15 topics at once. So I think that this is good to kind of hone in on one subject. And it sounds like people are learning. So let's see. David says, wow, 90 minutes already. So much fun. It went by quick. So yeah, it is kind of nuts.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much more that we could be talking about on hot staging
Exactly.
but I don't want to bore people with numbers. Or
No,
take
go.
3
I
hours.
mean, go ahead, because I was going to sort of say the same thing. Is that we've only kind of scratched the surface of what's there. There are all these other little fine minutia to go into, and Ozan, bring those up. I think it will be interesting.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was looking at when I was looking at this was how much heat flux do you have? Heat transfer per square meter on the plate and on those vents and the stringers between the vents, right? And one thing to keep in mind is that the heat flux is basically proportional to the square root of your exhaust density and to the cube of your exhaust velocity. But in the case of the Raptor, it's not changing. But you have this hot hypersonic flow. It can be modeled fairly similarly to a reentry. And if you use some of those same equations, I went with the Sutton-Graves method for those who want to look that up. What you end up with depending on what assumptions you make, is you end up with somewhere on the order of like a 1 to 2 megawatt per square meter of heat flux on that cone. If you fire the RVACs. For the sea level engines, it's going to be higher. So it's going to be proportional to the radius of your nozzle. And that's, 1 or 2 megawatts may not mean a whole lot to a lot of people, but that's basically like 1,000 microwaves on an area about this big. Now, steel is not very conductive, but it's conductive enough that across 4 millimeters, what you end up with is a temperature rise of on the order of a couple hundred Kelvin, and you have several hundred more Kelvin to go. So you end up with this temperature gradient. The part of the steel that's touching the exhaust is hotter, and the other part is cooler. But there's nowhere for that to really go. Your radiative cooling is not enough to counter the heat flux in. So what's happening is that the heat capacity of the steel is just like soaking up that heat. And you have, I think, with 4 millimeter thick steel, you start out with on the order of like 14, 15, or if it's cooler, a little bit less. Kilojoules per degree Kelvin. So you get roughly about 100 Kelvin of heating per second. So every second that you have those RVACs firing at full thrust on that cone, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 Kelvin temperature increase on top of the temperature gradient that you have, where the surface is a little bit hotter, maybe a couple hundred Kelvin hotter than the backside. And the higher your flux, the bigger that temperature gradient as well. That's proportional to that. And of course, the higher your flux, the faster you get that temperature rise across the material. But one of the saving graces here is that steel's thermal conductivity and its heat capacity actually go up as it gets hotter. So that rate of temperature rise goes down, especially the peak temperature near the surface goes down. And you can go up to, you're starting at somewhere between probably about 200 to 300 Kelvin. It's, ambient temperature is going to be below 300. And as you go up in the higher atmosphere, it's going to be lower than that. But you also have all this cold propellant near you. So the steel is already starting pre-chilled. And you can go up to about 1,000 Kelvin before it starts to get permanently damaged. And you can go even further beyond that if you are willing to turn it into putty before it really melts. So you got, a good amount of time at full thrust. And as you're separating, within a few seconds, you're already far enough away that the heat flux has dropped significantly. The vents are a little bit of a bigger problem because they're smaller. So your heat flux ends up being, so if you're in the flow, the heat flux is rises as your structure gets smaller by the square root of that one-dimensional scaling factor, right? So if you have structures that are maybe 10 times smaller than the thing that you were just looking at, it's going to be about 3 times the heat flux. So for those, even with the plume expanding a little bit, even if they're very blunt, you end up with something on the order of 5-6 megawatts. And that's a little bit more iffy, right? You get a couple of seconds, and you get a higher temperature gradient. So that's where I'm wondering if some of those, especially those really sharp edges, if they're in the flow, like I can't tell how blunt they made those. People have asked, I think a lot of people would want to make those wedges, right? But then the tip of that is going to get even more heat flux.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why you kind of want that blunt so that it doesn't.
Yes.
It's not as likely to erode. So
And
that's probably going to make it, but it's not. I'm not as sure about that.
I'm not sure if you see this question.
Right.
Wouldn't the hot stage ring be more structurally sound if the support was diamond, triangular, or honeycomb shaped by design instead of horizontal and vertical supports?
Sort of. So the thing is that you've got this axial compression, right? And what you're really trying to do is to keep it from buckling. The compressive strength is high enough that as long as, so if you have like a T or I-shaped bar and you're trying to compress that actually has really good buckling resistance. If you and when you have that vertical ribbing, that's effectively what you're producing in that part of the cross section. You're producing that T, so that it's not gonna want to buckle in this direction or in this direction, right? You have a little bit of there are some angles where it's it's a little bit weaker, but it's pretty close to optimal. And if you have that kind of honeycomb structure, you're in some ways adding some mass that gives you good structural strength for resisting loads from a number of different directions, but it's not really optimized for that vertical loading.
Right. Yeah. It's you're resisting loads that you're never going to see.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a little bit optimized for that. Yeah.
Well, how about this for a final question here? So, in summary, what are your predictions? What are your predictions that we hear SpaceX mission control audio call out nominal orbit insertion for IF-2?
Yeah,
I put it at about
50%.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'll say that it's greater than 50%. I'll go that 80% that we get it in there. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't have like other little issues of things going along the way. That it's like it doesn't mean that the booster hasn't crashed or something like that. We're really just talking about Starship making it in there. So I think it's pretty good, because then there's the other things that once it makes it into orbit, does it get out of orbit? That's another set of questions on how it does. So I think everyone would think success if Starship is able to just get into orbit.
Yeah.
If it doesn't come back all the way, then that's something else. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's also the question of what is orbit? Is it going to be orbital? That's
right.
One of the big, because it's not finishing a complete orbit before its planned trajectory returns there.
Right. It has enough it has orbital velocity. It just does. It's what it was. It's basically it intersects back into the atmosphere without another burn, but that's intentional.
Right.
And if it seems like everything is there, then we know we can put it in there, but they don't want to do it for the first one. So yeah, I think it's greater than 50%. I'll go as high as 80%. They make it there, but it doesn't mean it's going to be flawless. It's going to be one of those things that they just kind of hopped across the finish line.
Well,
and what's interesting is that if they hadn't done hot staging, they would have had to start up in 0G, and we would have been able to say with a fair degree of confidence that, hey, Starship did it once. Like if it had made IFT1 or IFT2 without hot staging, we would know, okay, it can start in 0G. But we're not going to know that because it's not doing a second burn, and it's not doing that startup in 0G. And so for the next flight, even if this goes well, we're not going to know if it's going to be able to enter orbit or if it's just going to be a repeat of IFT2.
Right. Sorry, I muted him.
Yeah, phone's going crazy here.
Okay.
This
I
is
think
it.
that is, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so well, I think that this was a very people are like, who's calling? I think that this was a very informative live stream. So thank you, Ozon, for being a new guest with us here. I hope that you
My pleasure, Ellie. Thanks for having me on.
it.
Oh,
And
yeah.
Remind me, are you on the West Coast?
Yes.
Okay,
on the West Coast.
California?
Yes.
Okay, are you near any of the affected area right now?
No, wait, what's going on? Oh, you mean the hurricane and the earthquakes and the
Yeah.
with the fires? You know, we have
all that.
Yeah, no, not.
No, okay,
Fortunately,
good.
not. Sorry for the people that are. I don't know of. I haven't been keeping track. Are there casualties, or is it just kind of?
I don't think there are, but I haven't been as in tune with that either. Welcome back, Scott. I think we're going to wrap up because someone is trying to get a hold of you. And, yes.
Yep.
He says, Steve wants you to answer the phone and add whoever it is to the live stream.
No, it's just someone that needs a little bit of help with figuring out how the hot water heater gets turned on. That's all.
Oh man. Well, I really love the format of, kind of sticking to one topic. So I think we can make this a more regular thing. And thank you to everyone who joined. We had a pretty great sized audience today. So hope we made it's Monday, right? Yeah. Your Monday a little bit brighter. On Thursday night, I'm flying to Spain, so I'll try to get another live stream in before I go, but I will be pretty, checked out when I'm in Spain. So
enjoy your time there.
Yes.
Absolutely. Awesome. Enjoy it.
Well, thank you guys so much and have a great rest of your Monday.